In the autumn of 1780, the British Army holds South Carolina. Not most of it, all of it. Every port, every navigable river mouth, every fortified crossroads worth putting a garrison on. In the space of 3 months, it has destroyed 2 American armies in the field and taken more prisoners in a single morning than it has lost in 5 years of war on this continent. On paper, the war in the South is finished. The government of South Carolina has dissolved. Its governor is in another state. Its continental regiments are on prison ships in Charleston Harbor. And somewhere in the flooded timber between the Santee and the PD, a 48-year-old man with a badly set ankle and a few dozen followers is preparing to make the entire arrangement unworkable. He will do something considerably stranger. He will make the occupation cost more than it is worth. That is the campaign, compressed into one sentence, and it is worth asking how it is actually done. Not the legend of how it is done, which arrived early and has been in the way ever since, but the mechanics. Because the mechanics are unglamorous, repeatable, and still being taught to professional soldiers 240-odd years later. A few dozen men, somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 British and Loyalist troops in the theater. Those numbers do not describe a contest. They describe an arithmetic problem. And the interesting thing about this story is that Marion is the only man on the field who understands which quantity actually matters. To understand what Marion did, you have to understand how completely everything else had failed first. Not partially, not recoverably. Completely. The British had spent 3 years fighting an inconclusive war in the northern colonies and had concluded, reasonably enough, that they were fighting in the wrong place. The southern colonies were richer in exportable goods, thinner in continental troops, and, according to every report reaching London, full of colonists who had never wanted this war and would gladly return to the King's peace if somebody competent turned up to offer it. This was called the Southern Strategy. It had one enormous virtue. In theory, it was cheap. Regular troops would take the ports and the interior forts. Local loyalists would garrison, police, and pacify. The regulars would then move north, rolling up the rebellion state by state, and meet Washington's army from below while it was still looking the other way. In December of 1779, Sir Henry Clinton sailed from New York to begin it. With a fleet of some 90 transports and warships and more than 13,500 soldiers and sailors aboard. By the time the siege lines closed around Charleston in the spring, his land force stood at roughly 12,000 to 13,000 men. British regulars, light infantry, grenadiers, German regiments hired by contract, Loyalist provincial corps raised in America, with artillery and cavalry attached, and a fleet in support. Charleston was the 4th largest city in the colonies, and the entire Southern war effort ran through its harbor. It was also, in the spring of 1780, close to indefensible. The landward fortifications were old and had been allowed to decay. Major General Benjamin Lincoln held the city with something over 6,000 men on paper, a good many of them militia and armed townspeople rather than soldiers, and he was relying on further reinforcement from the surrounding countryside to make up the difference. That reinforcement largely did not come. Not because the countryside was disloyal, much of it wasn't, but because of something that appears in most accounts as a single line and deserves considerably more attention than it usually gets. Smallpox had broken out in Charleston. It was the first outbreak inside the city walls in 20 years, which meant an entire generation of South Carolinians had no acquired immunity and knew exactly what that meant. Governor John Rutledge issued the call for militia. The militia looked at the call, looked at the city, and worked out that marching into a besieged town with smallpox in it was a way to die without ever seeing a redcoat. They were not wrong. They also doomed the garrison. Rutledge tried everything available to a man with nothing, including writing to the Spanish authorities in Havana to ask for ships and troops. Spain was at war with Britain and had every strategic reason to help. Spain declined. The siege closed at the end of March. Clinton's engineers drove their parallels forward across the neck of the peninsula in the methodical, unhurried European fashion. Dig, advance, dig again, bring the guns closer. And there is nothing a garrison can do about that except break out, be relieved, or surrender. Nobody was coming to relieve them. Lincoln offered terms twice in late April, proposing to give up the city if his army were allowed to march away. Clinton refused both times and resumed the bombardment. On the 12th of May, 1780, Lincoln surrendered. Roughly 5,466 men went into captivity, of whom about 2,500 were Continental regulars, the rest militia, sailors, and townsmen. The British also took over 300 cannon, some 6,000 muskets, and the powder to fire them. Battle casualties on both sides were remarkably light. Fewer than 300 killed and wounded altogether, and an accidental magazine explosion after the surrender killed roughly twice as many men as the siege itself had. It was the largest surrender of American forces in the entire Revolutionary War. Everything the Continental Congress had in the South went into captivity in one morning. What followed was not chaos. It was administration, which is worse. Clinton sailed for New York in June with a substantial part of the army, leaving Lieutenant General Charles Lord Cornwallis in command of the Southern Theater and instructions to secure it. Cornwallis was an intelligent, aggressive, thoroughly competent officer, and he did precisely what the situation called for. He built a lattice of garrisons across the state: Georgetown on the coast, Camden inland on the Wateree, 96 out toward the Appalachian foothills, with smaller posts filling the gaps between. Each garrison held a road junction, a river crossing, or a supply depot. Each could reinforce its neighbors. Regular troops held the nodes. Loyalist militia held everything else, patrolling, confiscating rebel property, administering oaths of allegiance, and settling 4 years of accumulated neighborhood grievances with official sanction. That last part matters more than the garrison map does. The war in the Carolina backcountry was not primarily Britain against American. It was Carolinian against Carolinian, and it had been simmering well before Lexington. British occupation did not create that conflict. It armed one side of it and gave it a flag. By July, the state had been comprehensively pacified. Rutledge had fled to North Carolina. The South Carolina government existed as a governor, a horse, and a commission book. And here is the part that would prove decisive, though nobody could see it yet. The British system was built to defeat armies. It was extremely good at that. Everything about it, the garrisons, the supply convoys, the loyalty oaths, the chain of command running from Charleston to London, assumed that the enemy was a thing with a location. Find the thing, fight the thing, take its capital, capture its regiments, accept its surrender, and the war ends. That system had just worked perfectly. It was about to encounter an enemy with no location at all, and it had no procedure for that whatsoever. Cornwallis needed the backcountry quiet so he could march north into North Carolina and Virginia without leaving his supply lines exposed behind him. He was 3 months away from discovering that the backcountry was not going to be quiet. And the man who would ensure it was, at that moment, lying in a bed on the Santee River with a shattered ankle, entirely unfit for duty, and, for reasons that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with a dinner party, not in a British prison. He was for reasons that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with a dinner party. not in a British prison. On the 19th of March, 1780, with the British already ashore and closing on Charleston, Francis Marion attended dinner at a house on Trad Street. He was a lieutenant colonel commanding the 2nd South Carolina Continental Regiment, 48 years old, and by every surviving description, a poor fit for the evening's entertainment. 18th century Charleston hospitality had a custom the modern viewer should try to picture honestly. The host locked the dining room door, not as a joke, as a rule. Guests drank the host's toasts, all of them, in sequence, and the door opened when the last man was under the table. Leaving early was an insult. The lock removed the option. Marion did not drink. This is one of the few things about his personal habits that multiple contemporaries agree on. He sat through as much of it as he could stand, decided he was not going to be able to stand the rest, and, finding the door locked, opened a window on the upper floor and jumped. He broke his ankle badly. That is the story. Now the necessary caution, because this channel does not hand you legend dressed as fact. The jump comes to us principally through Peter Horry, who served under Marion and knew him, and through Mason Locke Weems, who edited Horry's manuscript into a bestseller. We will be coming back to Weems repeatedly, so it is worth establishing his character now. He is the man who invented George Washington and the cherry tree. He did not report history. He manufactured national scripture, and he was extremely good at it. What is independently solid is the outcome. Marion was evacuated from Charleston in April on medical grounds, with an injured leg, and went to recuperate at Pond Bluff, his plantation on the Santee. When the garrison surrendered in May and the Continental Officer Corps of the Southern Army went into captivity, he was inland and unfit to walk. Whether he acquired the injury by jumping out of a window to escape enforced drinking is a detail we have on the authority of a man who also gave us a hatchet and a cherry tree. It is entirely plausible. It is not, in the strict sense, established. What is not in doubt is the consequence. A minor domestic accident in a house on a street in a city removed one lieutenant colonel from the roster weeks before that roster was captured in its entirety. Of all the field officers the Southern Department possessed, the one who happened to be absent was the one whose entire military instinct ran against everything the Southern Department had just been destroyed doing. So who was he? Francis Marion was born around 1732 in Berkeley County, South Carolina, into a family of French Huguenots, Protestants who had fled France after Louis XIV revoked their legal protections in 1685. That heritage is not decorative background. Huguenot families in Carolina were a tight, intermarried, commercially successful minority, with a living memory of what a state does to people it decides are inconvenient. Marion grew up inside a community that understood, as an inherited fact rather than a political theory, that governments can turn on you. Physically, he was unimpressive to the point that nearly everyone who wrote about him mentioned it. The figures usually quoted put him at around 5'2" and 110 pounds, though these come from the biographers rather than from any muster roll. He was knock-kneed, walked with a limp that predated the ankle, and had a long face with a pronounced hooked nose. Weems supplies the memorable line that as an infant, he was no larger than a New England lobster, which is a wonderful sentence and is also Weems. Strip the ornament away, and a consistent picture survives. A small, dark, physically awkward man who did not look like a soldier, did not sound like an orator, and was systematically underestimated by everyone who met him for the first time. He was going to make a career out of that. His first attempt at a life was the sea. At about 15, he signed onto a schooner bound for the West Indies. The ship went down. The crew got into an open boat and spent roughly a week adrift before making land. And some of them did not make it. Weems has the vessel rammed by a whale, which, the viewer will not be surprised to learn, appears in no other account and looks a great deal like Weems. The shipwreck itself is well enough attested. Marion came home and did not go back to sea. He farmed. For 9 years, nothing happened to him worth recording. Then in 1757, he and his brother were recruited for the war against France. And by 1759, he was on the Cherokee frontier. This is where Francis Marion actually learned his trade. And it is worth being precise about what that education consisted of, because it was not the education the rest of the American officer corps received. The Anglo-Cherokee War was fought in mountains and dense forest against opponents who did not form line, did not stand to receive a volley, and did not consider it dishonorable to shoot at you from cover and then leave. British and colonial columns marched into narrow ground, took casualties from an enemy they frequently never saw, burned the towns they could reach, and marched out again, having accomplished the destruction of property and very little else. Marion, by the accounts that survive, was ordered to clear a defended defile with a small party, 30 men in the version that comes down to us, and did it, at a cost of 21 of them. That figure also traces back through the biographers rather than through official returns. So hold it loosely. Hold the lesson tightly, because the lesson is the point. Here is what a man learns in that country. He learns that terrain is not scenery. It is an active participant. He learns that a formation which is unbreakable in an open field becomes a queue of targets in a defile. He learns that the side which chooses where and when to fight is doing something categorically different from the side which merely turns up. And he learns, this is the one that matters most, that an enemy who refuses to be found cannot be beaten, no matter how thoroughly you are equipped to beat him. You will sometimes see it claimed that Marion studied Robert Rogers's famous rules for ranging companies. There is no evidence that he did, and there is a straightforward chronological problem with the claim. Rogers published those rules in 1765, 4 years after Marion's frontier fighting ended. Marion did not need a manual. He had been shot at in the mountains by people who were better at this than he was, and he had paid attention. 2 decades later, when the Revolution came, he was a middle-aged planter and militia veteran who took a Continental Commission and spent the early war doing conventional work. Promoted major in 1776, then lieutenant colonel the same year. Present at the defense of Sullivan's Island, command of the 2nd South Carolina Regiment from 1778. The failed Allied assault on Savannah in 1779. Competent, unremarkable. Nothing in his continental service predicted what was coming. His officers found him difficult. He was silent for long stretches, made decisions without explaining them, and enforced discipline in a way that irritated men who had volunteered and felt that volunteering entitled them to opinions. One subordinate's assessment survives, and it is not flattering. An ugly, cross, knock-kneed, hook-nosed son of a bitch. That is a real quote from a real officer who served under him. Keep it. The men who followed Marion were not following a beloved figure. They were following a commander who kept getting them home, because the other half of the picture is equally consistent across sources. He ate what they ate, which was frequently nothing much. He slept on the ground with them. He did not spend their lives to impress anyone. And in a war where reputation was currency and glory was how militia officers got promoted, that restraint was genuinely unusual. Weems says his dress sword rusted in its scabbard from disuse, an image rather than a document. but pointing at something true. Marion was not in the business of personal combat. He was in the business of arriving where he was not expected and leaving before the answer came. Through the second half of 1780, with the state under occupation and its government in exile, Governor Rutledge issued militia commissions to whoever was left. Marion would hold one as a brigadier general of South Carolina militia. The exact date is muddy in the record, and both the autumn and December of that year are defensible. The commission gave him legal authority over a brigade. He did not have a brigade. What he had was an ankle that had healed crooked, a horse, and a plan he had not yet found anybody willing to listen to. So he went looking for the American army. He found it. It was worse than useless, and it was about to be destroyed. He found it. It was worse than useless, and it was about to be destroyed. In the summer of 1780, Congress sent a new army south under Major General Horatio Gates. Gates arrived with a reputation built on Saratoga 3 years earlier, where a British army had surrendered to forces under his command, a victory in which his personal contribution has been argued about ever since, and which he had allowed nobody to forget. He also arrived with a firm and entirely conventional set of opinions. Battles were decided by regulars in line. Militia were unreliable, ill-disciplined, and useful mainly for occupying ground, while real soldiers did the work. Irregular operations were a distraction from the serious business of the campaign, which was to march on the British post at Camden and fight. In August, Marion rode into Gates's camp with about 20 followers. The reception is one of the best documented moments in this entire campaign, because a Continental staff officer wrote it down. And what he wrote is not flattering to anybody. Colonel Otho Holland Williams, the adjutant general, an intelligent and generally fair-minded man, recorded that the newcomer's appearance was so wretched, so far outside anything resembling military form, that the Continental officers had to actively stop their own soldiers from laughing at them out loud. Sit with the picture for a second. 20-odd men in whatever clothes they owned, farm horses, hunting weapons, some of them boys, some of them black. Their commander a small limping man in his late 40s on a bad leg. They were the only functioning armed representatives of the government of South Carolina, and a professional army laughed at them. Gates did not know what to do with Marion, and did not spend long thinking about it. He gave him a task that was simultaneously dismissive and unintentionally transformative. Go back down to the PD country. Take command of the militia there, gather intelligence, and destroy the boats along the Santee so the British could not use the river to escape after Gates beat them. Read the order carefully, and you can see the whole shape of Gates's mind in it. He was already planning the enemy's retreat. He was assigning a man to sweep up behind a victory that had not happened. Marion took the order and rode south. On the 16th of August, Gates met Cornwallis outside Camden. He put his experienced Continental regulars on the right and his untried militia on the left, directly opposite the British regulars, a deployment that placed the least reliable troops against the most dangerous ones. He had also, the previous night, ordered his hungry men fed on a mixture of half-cooked meat, cornmeal, and molasses, with the predictable digestive results, and then marched them through the dark to arrive in contact at dawn. The militia on the left broke almost immediately, before serious contact, and ran. The Continentals on the right fought hard, were flanked, and were destroyed. Gates himself left the field on a fast horse and did not stop for a very long distance, a detail his enemies made certain was never forgotten. In 3 months, the Americans had lost 2 armies in South Carolina. There was now no Continental force of any size between the Savannah River and the North Carolina line. And Francis Marion was away to the east, alive, unengaged, and in command of a militia district, because a general who thought he was worthless had sent him out of the way. That is the second accident in this story. and it is worth pausing on the pattern. The first accident kept him out of Charleston. The second kept him out of Camden. Both were the direct result of other men deciding that he did not matter. On the 17th of August, the day after Camden, though news traveled slowly enough that Marion did not yet know what had happened, he arrived at Witherspoon's Ferry on the Lynch's River and formally took command of the Williamsburg militia from Major John James. Now, numbers. You will see the figure of 30 repeated constantly in accounts of this campaign, including in the title of this episode, and it deserves examination rather than repetition. Surviving estimates of Marion's initial strength range from about 20 to about 70 men, depending on which pension application, which letter, and which week you take as your baseline. 30 is the figure that appears most often in the earliest correspondence, and it is a fair representative number. But the more accurate answer is that the question is slightly wrong, and understanding why is understanding the campaign. Marion's brigade did not have a strength. It had a tide. These were volunteers, unpaid volunteers, providing their own horses, their own weapons, their own powder, and largely their own food. They had farms. They had families living inside an occupied district under a loyalist militia that was actively burning the property of known rebels. When a man's presence was needed at home for a harvest, for a threat, for a birth or a burial, he went home, and then, often, he came back. So the brigade was a few dozen men in August and several hundred in October, and could be a dozen again a fortnight after that. Marion never knew on any given morning exactly what he commanded. He built a method that did not require him to know. Remember this: it is the first thing that would have to be true for any of what follows to work. And it is the thing that would eventually make Marion indispensable to men who had once laughed at him. And it sat directly across the British line of communication between Charleston and Camden. That last fact is the one that converted Marion from a local nuisance into a strategic problem. Everything Cornwallis's army at Camden ate, fired, or wore came up from Charleston. It came by river or by the road that ran beside it. And both of them ran through the country Marion had just been handed by a man who thought he was giving him a chore. Marion did not begin by attacking. He began by listening. For several days, he moved his small force through the district, gathering the one commodity he had in genuine abundance and the British had none of: information. And a British column was about to walk down the Santee Road, carrying something Marion wanted very badly. After Camden, the British had a logistical problem of their own. Several hundred captured American Continentals who had to be moved to the prison ships at Charleston. In the third week of August, a detachment of the 63rd Regiment of Foot set out down the Santee Road, escorting roughly 150 prisoners of the Maryland line. They were regulars. The prisoners were disarmed and exhausted. The country was pacified. The escort had no reason to expect trouble, and by every reasonable assessment available to its commander, there was none to expect. Marion knew they were coming. He knew the route, the approximate strength of the escort, and the schedule. He had 52 men. Now, what follows is the first demonstration of a method Marion would use for the rest of the war. So it is worth slowing down and taking it apart properly, rather than simply describing the fight. Step 1. He does not intercept them on the road. He gets ahead of them and waits at the place they will stop. The escort halted overnight at a house near the ferry crossing at Great Savannah. That is a normal, sensible thing for a column to do. It is also the single most predictable act in the entire march. And predictability is the commodity Marion trades in. Step 2. He splits the 52. A detachment goes around to cut the road on the far side. sealing the escape route toward Charleston. The main body comes at the house from the other direction. The prisoners are not the objective of the attack. They are the objective of the operation, which is not the same thing. And the difference is where amateur commanders go wrong. Marion's men are not told to rescue anybody. They are told to kill or capture the guards, because guards who are dead or on the ground do not need to be negotiated with. Step 3. Before dawn on the 20th of August, they go in. It is over in minutes. Speed, darkness, and complete surprise against men who were asleep in a country they believed had been conquered. The escort is overwhelmed. Around 20 British and Loyalist soldiers are taken prisoner, and by one account, only about 10 of the guard get away. All 150 Maryland Continentals are freed. And then the part of the story that nobody putting this on a recruiting poster wants. The Continentals do not want to fight. Marion offers them arms, horses if he has them, and a place in his brigade. The overwhelming majority refuse. They have been through a siege, a rout, and a forced march to captivity in the space of 3 months. And they have been liberated in the dark by 52 strangers in farm clothes who propose to keep operating behind British lines with no supply, no pay, and no army. Most of them make for North Carolina and keep going. Only a small handful stay. Marion does not appear to have held it against them. He did, however, learn something permanent from it, and you can see it in every subsequent decision he made. Men fight where they have something to lose. A Maryland Continental in South Carolina has nothing to defend. A Williamsburg farmer whose neighbor's house was burned last week has a great deal. Marion never again tried to recruit outside his own country. Militarily, Great Savannah is trivial. 20 prisoners, a brief firefight, no ground taken, no post reduced. And by nightfall, Marion has withdrawn east toward the PD and the road is British again. Strategically, it is a bomb. Consider what the British command has to conclude from it. The Santee Road is not safe. That is not an opinion, it is now a demonstrated fact. And the demonstration was performed on regular troops of the 63rd Foot. Every convoy from now on requires a real escort. Every escort is soldiers not doing something else. Every prisoner column, every powder wagon, every dispatch rider now carries a risk that has to be priced. And there is a second effect, harder to measure and considerably more dangerous to the occupation. Word traveled. In a countryside where the only news for 3 months had been catastrophe, the story that arrived in the Williamsburg district in late August was that somebody had hit the British on the main road and won, and that he was still out there, and that he was one of theirs. Men began riding out to find him. This is the mechanism that would keep the Southern Rebellion alive through its worst autumn, and it is not a military mechanism at all. Marion was not generating combat power. He was generating the belief that resistance was survivable, and in an occupied country, that belief is the only resource that actually matters. Every man who chose not to take the loyalty oath in September of 1780 did so partly because of a 20-minute fight at a ferry crossing that killed almost nobody. Cornwallis noticed. Within days, he had ordered a regular officer with regular troops to go and deal with the problem in the PD country. And Marion, now roughly 60 miles east of the Santee, resting his horses at Port's Ferry, was about to find out how fast the answer came. Quick note before we go further into the swamp with them. If you'd rather listen than watch, we're now also live on Spotify. Full episodes, same narration, and you can take them with you. Links below. Right, back to it. Because before the British could reach him, somebody closer got there first. And the men who came for Marion in the first week of September were not redcoats at all. They were his neighbors. The men who came for Marion in the first week of September were not redcoats at all. They were his neighbors. Cornwallis had instructed the Loyalist militia of the region to cooperate with the regular effort against Marion. And in the country between the PD and the Little PD, that instruction landed on Major Micajah Gainey. Gainey was a local man. So was his second, Captain Jesse Barfield. They had raised somewhere between 200 and 250 Loyalist militia from the surrounding farms, with a small detachment of the 63rd Foot attached, and they intended to settle the Marion problem themselves. This is the shape of the war in the Carolina backcountry, and it is worth stopping on. Marion's 50-odd men and Gainey's 250 were drawn from the same handful of river districts. They knew the same fords. Some of them were related. The redcoats were, in a real sense, the smallest part of what was happening here. On the morning of the 4th of September, Gainey put his men on the road to attack Marion's camp. Marion had already been told. He was on the road before dawn, moving the other way. The two forces met on Britain's Neck. Marion's advance guard under Major John James struck Gainey's advance party first and scattered it, and Gainey's main body, 200 men who had expected to fall on a sleeping camp and were instead being charged in the open, came apart and ran for the swamps. Barfield rallied part of them and came back. That was the mistake. Marion had pulled back toward a defile near Blue Savannah, and he put his men in the brush on either side of the track and waited. Barfield rode into it with roughly 200 men and lost the fight in about the time it takes to understand you are in one. The Loyalists broke a second time and fled into the Little PD swamp. Estimates of the Loyalist loss run to 30 or 50 killed and wounded. Marion lost 4 men wounded and 2 horses killed. And then came the thing that mattered more than the casualty figures. The next day, about 60 local volunteers rode into Marion's camp and joined him. His force had roughly doubled overnight, from around 50 men to around 110. And it had doubled for a reason that has nothing to do with patriotism in the abstract. The Tory militia east of the PD had just been beaten twice in one morning by their own neighbors. Every man in that district who had been waiting to see which way the wind blew had now seen something. This is the second demonstration of the same mechanism, and by now, you should be able to see it operating. Marion is not accumulating soldiers by recruitment. He is accumulating them by evidence. 2 days later, on the 7th, he moved to Port's Ferry on the eastern bank of the PD and fortified it, building an earthwork and emplacing 2 small field pieces, guns he had somehow acquired in the confusion of that summer. Because at that same moment, roughly 40 miles to the west in the neighborhood of Kingstree, Major James Wemyss of the 63rd Regiment was sitting with something in the region of 270 men, waiting for reinforcements out of Camden and reading the same reports Marion's success had generated. Cornwallis wanted Marion finished. The orders that went out were not for a patrol. They were for an operation, and the force allocated to it ran by some accounts to well over 1,000 men against Marion's 100. Marion's scouts brought that back to him at Port's Ferry. He had just won twice. He had doubled his brigade. He had built a fortified post with artillery in it. Every instinct that makes a man popular said, hold the ground he had just taken. He was about to do the exact opposite, and it would cost him the district. He was about to do the exact opposite, and it would cost him the district. Marion did the sum at Port's Ferry, and the sum came out one way only. He could not beat several hundred regulars with 100 volunteers, not with surprise, not on any ground in the district, not with 2 light field pieces in an earthwork. There was no clever maneuver available. There was no version of the engagement that ended with his brigade intact. So he did the hardest thing a commander can do in front of men whose homes are about to be burned. He sent Major John James forward first, not to fight, but to take a prisoner. James's party went out, picked up a British soldier, and brought him back to be questioned, and what the man said confirmed the numbers. Some accounts also describe a sharper clash with Wemyss's people around this time, with losses on both sides. The details vary between tellings, and the figures are not well founded, so we will not pretend to a precision the record does not support. What is certain is what Marion did with the intelligence once he had it. He abandoned the position. The 2 field pieces he had emplaced at Port's Ferry a fortnight earlier went into the swamp. Guns are heavy. Guns need roads. Guns move at the speed of oxen, and they announce your position to anyone within earshot. And Marion was not going to be slowed down by the most prestigious object in 18th century warfare. Then he let a portion of his men go home. Marion wrote to Gates about it afterwards, and the phrasing is worth having exactly. His men, he said, were desirous of seeing their wives and families which had been burnt out. He found it necessary to retreat the next morning, and he rode north with about 60 followers, across the state line into North Carolina, to the country of the Great White Marsh near Amos's Mill on Drowning Creek. Read that sequence as it would have looked to the men involved, because this is the moment that separates Marion from every other partisan commander in the theater. He has just won 2 engagements. His force has doubled. He holds a fortified post with artillery, and he responds by throwing the guns into a swamp, dismissing half his men and leaving the state. Thomas Sumter, the other great South Carolina partisan commander operating to the west, braver by any conventional measure and considerably more popular, would not have done that. Sumter fought when he was angry, took ground he could not hold, and was surprised and routed more than once, most catastrophically at Fishing Creek that same August, because he could not make himself walk away from an engagement. Marion could always walk away. That is the entire difference, and it is why one of them still had a brigade the following spring. There is no glory in the retreat to Drowning Creek. There is no painting of it. But it was the most professional decision anybody made in South Carolina that autumn. And it had a price, which Marion knew perfectly well when he made it, and which the district paid in full while he was gone. Because Major James Wemyss now had the PD country entirely to himself. Wemyss had come out from Camden in early September with the 63rd Foot and Loyalist militia attached, under instructions to break up the partisan bands and punish the districts sheltering them. He interpreted that expansively, and for roughly a fortnight, he was effectively unopposed. What followed was systematic. Houses burned, livestock driven off or killed, horses confiscated, which in a mounted partisan war is not theft, it is disarmament. Mills destroyed, and a mill in 1780 is not a building. It is a district's ability to turn grain into food. The corridor of destruction is usually described as running about 70 miles through the country between the Santee and the PD. Wemyss himself reported to Cornwallis that he had seen to the burning of more than 50 houses and plantations. And then he did the thing that historians of this campaign keep returning to. He burned the Indiantown Presbyterian Church. Understand what that meant in that particular district. The Williamsburg settlement was Scots-Irish Presbyterian. Indiantown had been founded in 1757 by settlers including John James, the same John James who was now a major in Marion's brigade, and who had recruited Patriot militia from his position as an elder of that congregation. The church was not merely a religious building. It was the community's meeting house, its records office, its social center, and the institutional memory of families who had crossed an ocean because a state had once tried to tell them how to worship. Wemyss regarded such congregations as sedition shops and ordered them burned wherever he found them. He was correct about the diagnosis and catastrophically wrong about the treatment. Here is the part that a modern viewer, with 2.5 centuries of counterinsurgency experience to draw on, will recognize instantly, and which nobody in the British command in 1780 could see at all. Collective punishment against a population that is sheltering partisans does not separate the population from the partisans. It welds them together. Every family Wemyss burned out had, that same week, a specific and personal reason to support Marion that had nothing to do with political theory or the rights of Englishmen. Men who had been neutral in August were riding north to find Marion in September. Men who had taken British protection and gone home now had nothing to go home to. Wemyss had independent command for a fortnight in his entire career. In that fortnight, he did more damage to the British position in South Carolina than any American commander managed all year. Marion waited in North Carolina. He rested the horses. He gathered the men who came north to find him. And there were more of them every week, for reasons that were currently on fire. And on the 24th of September, he turned around and rode back into South Carolina. There was a Loyalist post on Black Mingo Creek, and its commander had made one small mistake about where the noise would come from. There was a Loyalist post on Black Mingo Creek, and its commander had made one small mistake about where the noise would come from. Marion came back into South Carolina in late September, linked up with John James and the militia that had reassembled, and rode roughly 30 miles in a day to reach the Black Mingo country. He had about 150 men, which by his standards was an army. His target was a Loyalist detachment posted at Dollard's Tavern near Shepherd's Ferry on the south bank of Black Mingo Creek. It was commanded by Colonel John Cumming Ball, a local man, a Carolinian, holding the district for the crown. This is the neighbor war again, undisguised. Ball and Marion were both South Carolinians from the same low country, and some of the men about to shoot at each other in the dark had known each other before the war. Marion's plan was the one that had worked at Nelson's Ferry. Arrive silently in the dark, seal the exits, hit the post before it can form. He timed the approach for around midnight on the night of the 28th of September. The route to the tavern crossed the Black Mingo at Willtown Bridge, a wooden bridge, planked, about a mile north of the Loyalist position. 150 horses went onto those planks. In swamp country at midnight, with still air and water to carry the sound, 150 shod horses crossing a plank bridge is not a noise. It is an announcement, and it traveled the full mile to Ball's sentries with time to spare. Marion heard it happen. There was nothing to be done about it. Half his column was already across. By the time the partisans came off the bridge, the surprise they had ridden 30 miles to achieve was gone. Ball had somewhere between 50 and 100 Loyalists, he had warning, and he did the correct thing with it. He moved his men out of the tavern into the open ground beside it and formed to meet the attack, which meant Marion's people would be riding into a prepared volley instead of a sleeping camp. Most commanders at that moment break off. The whole basis of the operation has evaporated. Coming on means attacking a formed, alerted body of troops holding ground of its own choosing with tired horses at night. Ball's first volley was well delivered, and it hurt. It caught Marion's men as they were dismounting to attack on foot, the most vulnerable 30 seconds in mounted infantry warfare, when a man is neither a rider nor yet a soldier in a line, and several of his officers went down in it. And here is where the value of everything Marion had built became visible. He did not charge. He did not withdraw. He reorganized in the dark, under fire, in about the time it takes to describe it. Major Hugh Horry was sent dismounted against the Loyalist right. Captain Thomas Waits was sent around the tavern to strike the center. A small mounted party went to cut the line of retreat. 3 separate elements, 3 separate axes, executed by unpaid volunteers in darkness with no signaling system beyond a shouted order and prior familiarity. The Loyalists held their fire until the Americans were inside 30 yards. And then it became a close-quarters fight in the dark beside a tavern, at a range where the accuracy of a rifle is irrelevant, and the only things that matter are aggression and knowing which shapes are yours. It lasted about 15 minutes. Then Ball's line broke, and the Loyalists ran into the Black Mingo Swamp, which is exactly the direction men run when they are local and terrified. Into the country they know, in the dark, where horsemen cannot follow. The butcher's bill was small by the standards of the war and heavy by the standards of this brigade. Marion lost 2 killed, one of them, Captain George Logan, and 8 wounded. The Loyalists lost around 3 killed and 13 wounded or captured. What Marion carried away mattered more than the casualty figures. Horses, muskets, powder, and lead. The perpetual constraint, relieved for a few weeks. Baggage, the entire material stock of a Loyalist post, transferred to a force that had no other means of resupply. He also took Colonel Ball's personal horse, a good one, and kept it as his own mount for the rest of the war. He named it Ball. That detail is usually told as a joke, and it is funny. But look at what it actually does. In a neighbor war, in a district where everyone knows everyone, the rebel general rides the Loyalist colonel's horse in public, and everybody knows whose horse it is. That is not humor. That is a message delivered to every fence-sitter in the district about who is currently winning and what happens to men who bet on the crown. And there is one more consequence, small and revealing, which is why this fight is taught rather than merely recounted. From Black Mingo onward, Marion's brigade carried blankets and quilts to lay over the planking of wooden bridges before crossing them at night. That is a very small thing. It is also exactly what a learning organization looks like. The British Army in South Carolina made the same category of mistake, assuming a pacified countryside, assuming a safe road, assuming Loyalist militia could hold ground alone, over and over for 18 months, at every level of command, because there was no mechanism for a failure at one post to change the behavior of the next. Marion's brigade lost a night's surprise to a noisy bridge once, and never lost it that way again. 3 engagements in 6 weeks. A prisoner column freed on the main road, a Loyalist militia broken twice in a morning, a Crown post destroyed in a night assault, and a brigade that had gone from about 50 men to 150 and was still growing. So it is worth stopping the chronology here and asking what these men actually were. Because the answer is smaller, stranger, and considerably more complicated than the paintings suggest. Because the answer is smaller, stranger, and considerably more complicated than the paintings suggest. Start with the equipment, because the equipment tells you the situation better than any casualty return. A British regular in South Carolina carried a land-pattern musket, the Brown Bess, issued, standardized, with a bayonet that turned him into part of a hedge of steel when he stood beside other men carrying the same thing. His cartridges were made to a specification. His replacement parts fitted. When his shoes wore out, the army had shoes. Marion's men carried what they owned. Hunting weapons mostly, long-barreled, accurate, slow to reload, and useless in a bayonet fight because there was nowhere to put a bayonet. Powder and lead were the permanent crisis of the brigade. There was no depot. There was no ration. What they had came from what they took, and a partisan who fires 40 rounds in a battle he did not need to fight. has disarmed himself more effectively than the enemy could. That constraint shaped Marion's tactics more than any doctrine did. He could not afford a long engagement, not metaphorically, literally, in cartridges. Every fight he chose had to be short, decisive, and ideally profitable in captured supply. When he armed the recruits who came in that autumn, he armed a good many of them with British firearms taken at Nelson's Ferry. When they needed swords, and mounted men need swords because a man on a horse cannot reload, they went to the sawmills. Crosscut saw blades, cut down and beaten out by backcountry blacksmiths into heavy, crude, unbalanced broadswords. Ugly weapons, extremely effective against a man on foot. Then the horses. And here you have to adjust your assumptions about what this campaign physically was. This was not infantry warfare. Marion's brigade was mounted almost entirely, and its horses were the single most valuable thing it possessed, not for charging, for arriving. The operational pattern was to cover 40, 50, 60 miles overnight, strike at first light, and be gone before a response could be organized. That is only possible on horseback, and it is only sustainable if the horses are sound. So Marion guarded them obsessively. He rested them when he could have pushed. He rationed the men before he rationed the animals. He understood something the British cavalry commanders sent to hunt him understood too, but could not act on. A dismounted partisan is not a slower partisan. He is a captured one. Now the men themselves, and this is the part that most popular accounts flatten into a single beige mass of buckskin. Marion's brigade was a genuine cross-section of the Carolina backcountry, and the sections did not usually mix. There were wealthy planters riding beside men who owned nothing. There were boys in their early teens. There were Catawba Indians fighting alongside the Americans in pursuit of their own long-running strategic interests, which had nothing to do with anybody's revolution. There were Presbyterian ferry families like the Witherspoons, who brought something worth more than manpower. They knew every crossing, every shoal, every sandbar in a river system where knowing where the bottom is can decide a campaign. There was a detachment of local marksmen under Captain William McCawtrey, whose accuracy in close swamp country would become a standing problem for British patrols. In open ground, an 18th century rifle is a curiosity. Slow, no bayonet, outclassed by volley fire. At 60 yards in cane, against officers, it is a precision instrument for removing the enemy's ability to make decisions. And there were black men, enslaved and free. This requires care, and it requires more honesty than it usually gets. Black Americans served in Marion's brigade. That is documented in general terms and is not seriously disputed. Some were free, many were enslaved, serving as guides, oarsmen, foragers, couriers, and in some cases as combatants, and moving through a plantation landscape that gave them access to information no white partisan could have gathered. Enslaved people carried messages between plantations because enslaved people moving between plantations was unremarkable. That invisibility was a weapon, and Marion used it. The best-known individual is Oscar Marion, and here the record and the commemoration have to be separated carefully. That recognition is real. It is recent, and it corrected a 2-century silence in which the man at the fire, in one of the most reproduced images of the Revolution, was cataloged as an anonymous servant. What has to be said plainly is that the detailed service record, 7 years in the field, presence at Sullivan's Island, Savannah, Charleston, and Eutaw Springs, the roles of bugler and cook and bodyguard, comes overwhelmingly from that modern research and from the family tradition it recovered, rather than from 18th century documentation. The identification of a figure in a painting made decades after the war is an interpretation, however well-founded. rather than a signed statement by the artist. We are not disputing it. We are telling you where it comes from, because that is what this channel does with every claim, regardless of who it flatters. And there is a harder thing underneath, which the commemorative language tends to smooth over. Oscar Marion was not a volunteer in any sense a free man would recognize. He was legally the property of the officer he served. When accounts describe him as choosing patriotism over the British offer of freedom to those who fled to their lines, that framing quietly assumes a range of choice that an enslaved man in an armed camp did not possess. Perhaps he did choose. We have no way to know, because nobody with the power to record his reasoning ever asked him. Meanwhile, the state Marion fought for had issued orders that black people caught carrying supplies or intelligence for the British were to be executed under its laws. And Francis Marion, who slept on the ground with his men, who refused to spend lives cheaply, who is remembered as the most restrained commander in the Southern Theater, owned human beings and returned after the war to a plantation worked by them. Both of these things are true simultaneously. A war fought in the name of liberty, in a colony whose economy ran on its opposite, by men who mostly did not experience the contradiction as one. We are not going to resolve that for you, and we are not going to look away from it either. So that is the inventory. Volunteer, unpaid, unsupplied, mounted, socially incoherent, and fluctuating between a few dozen and several hundred with no warning, against roughly 8,000 professionals with a treasury behind them. Marion's answer to that disparity was not courage. Courage is common and it loses wars all the time. His answer was to change what the two sides were competing over. And the instrument he used was the ground itself. His answer was to change what the two sides were competing over. And the instrument he used was the ground itself. The South Carolina Low Country in 1780 was not the landscape you picture when you hear the word swamp. It was a system, and it had rules. Black water rivers ran between banks of cypress and tupelo, spreading into wide, flooded bottoms that changed shape with the rainfall. Cane brakes grew in dense stands taller than a man on horseback, and thick enough that a column had to go around or hack through. Between the rivers ran narrow ridges of higher ground, and those ridges carried the roads, because they were the only places a road could be. Anything with wheels went where the ridges went. There was no alternative route. That fact alone made the entire British logistical system predictable to anybody who knew the country, and Marion's men had grown up in it. Then the biology. The low country in late summer was a malarial environment, and malaria did not distinguish between armies, but it did distinguish between people. Locally raised men, exposed since childhood, carried a degree of acquired tolerance. Newly arrived British regulars and German troops did not. Sickness rates in the garrisons were serious enough to be a command problem in their own right, entirely separately from anything Marion did. Nor was he immune to it himself. His own officers went down with fever and ague that autumn, Peter Horry among them. Add water moccasins, alligators, mosquitoes in numbers that make sleep difficult, mud that pulls a shoe off a foot and does not give it back, and terrain that looks identical in every direction and drowns you if you guess wrong about where the bottom is. To a British officer, this was a vile obstacle to be crossed as quickly as possible. To Marion, it was a fortress that required no garrison, no construction, no maintenance, and no supply. That is the reframe on which the entire campaign turns. He is not hiding in the swamp. He is using the swamp as a fixed defensive work that his enemy cannot reduce, cannot bypass, and cannot even accurately map. Now the second component, and the one that professional soldiers studying this campaign tend to identify as the decisive one: information. Marion operated inside a population that was, in his districts, largely sympathetic to him, and more importantly, a population that lived there. Every ferry keeper, every miller, every farm wife on a road, every enslaved man sent between plantations with a message was a potential source. None of them looked like a scout. All of them noticed things. The result was an asymmetry so extreme that it is difficult to overstate. Marion generally knew where British and Loyalist detachments were, how strong they were, where they were going, and roughly when they would get there. The British generally did not know where Marion was at all. They knew where he had been, because there was a burned-out post or an emptied supply wagon there. This is what allowed a force of unpaid volunteers to survive in a theater containing thousands of professional soldiers, and it produced the single most important rule of the campaign. Marion only fought when he had already won. Not usually, not mostly. As policy. He did not accept engagements. He selected them from a menu of opportunities his intelligence network generated, and he declined everyone where the arithmetic was wrong. When a target was too strong, he did not fight it. When surprise was lost, he waited and sometimes went on anyway, as at Black Mingo, but only when he judged the odds still held. When a superior force came into the district, he dispersed the brigade entirely and reassembled it somewhere else days later. To a conventional officer, this looks like timidity. To an insurgent, it is the entire profession, and the officers who did not understand it were the ones who kept being handed catastrophes. Because here is the thing the British command in Charleston could never quite get its arms around. Marion was not trying to defeat the British Army. That was not an available goal, and he never pretended it was. He was attacking the occupation's operating costs. Consider what a single one of his raids actually purchases. He takes a supply wagon. The garrison at Camden is short. He burns a ferry. A courier route lengthens by 2 days. He shoots up a Loyalist militia post. Every Loyalist militiaman in the district now wonders whether the Crown can actually protect his family, and some of them go home. He cuts the road for one night. Dispatches arrive late, or not at all, and a general who cannot communicate cannot coordinate. None of that appears in a casualty return. All of it appears in the budget. That last line is the whole strategic argument of this episode, and it deserves stating flatly. Cornwallis's plan required him to move north into North Carolina and Virginia. He could only do that if South Carolina behind him was quiet enough to leave. Every regular he assigned to convoy escort, every dragoon he sent into the PD, every garrison he had to reinforce because the local Loyalists had lost their nerve. Every one of those was subtracted from the army that was supposed to be winning the war somewhere else. Marion did not have to beat Cornwallis. He had to make Cornwallis pay a tax every day, indefinitely, in the one currency the British could not print more of in America. Soldiers. This was not heroism, it was arithmetic. And in the last week of October, with the machine now fully assembled and the brigade at strength, he was about to demonstrate the whole of it in a single night, against a Loyalist force that was still in the process of putting itself together. He was about to demonstrate the whole of it in a single night, against a Loyalist force that was still in the process of putting itself together. Through October of 1780, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Tynes was raising Loyalist militia in the country west of the Black River, gathering men to reassert Crown control in the districts Marion had been operating in. It was a serious undertaking, and it came with a shipment of new arms brought up for issue to the recruits. They camped at Tearcoat Swamp, near where the Black River runs southeast through Clarendon County. On the 24th of October, Marion learned they were there. He called a muster, gathered about 150 men, many of them armed with the British muskets he had taken at Nelson's Ferry 2 months earlier, and moved on Kingstree, then turned west and rode hard for Tiercote. His scouts went in first and came back with a picture that told him everything he needed. The camp was not properly picketed. Many of the men were raw. Some of them had come in expecting to collect a weapon and go home again, and nobody was expecting an attack. Marion split his 150 into 3 companies and went in shortly after midnight. 6 killed, 14 wounded, 23 taken prisoner. The rest simply gone into the swamp. And once again, what Marion carried away was the point. Horses with their saddles, baggage, provisions, and more than 80 brand new muskets, along with the ammunition to go with them. The stock that had been brought up to arm the recruits delivered instead into the hands of the only force in the district that had no other way of getting any. Beat, that is the tidiest possible outcome in a partisan war. The enemy assembles a militia, equips it at his own expense, and you take delivery. Tynes himself escaped in the confusion and was picked up a few days later in the High Hills country. The rising he had spent weeks organizing simply ceased to exist. Now consider the cumulative effect through the British command's eyes, because by the end of October, the picture from Charleston was genuinely alarming. In 10 weeks, an unpaid militia force of uncertain size and no fixed location had freed a column of prisoners on the main road, broken the Loyalist militia of 2 river districts, survived a punitive expedition by regulars, destroyed a Crown post in a night assault, and dismantled a major Loyalist mobilization before it could take the field. The Santee Road was unreliable. Communication between Charleston and Camden was intermittent. And the Loyalist militia, the entire foundation of the Southern strategy, the thing that was supposed to make the whole scheme affordable, was visibly losing its nerve. Colonel Nisbet Balfour, commanding at Charleston, and Cornwallis in the field were both now writing about Marion by name, and in tones of increasing irritation. So Cornwallis sent the best tool he had. And by the 2nd week of November, the most feared cavalry officer in the British Army was riding into the PD country with orders to finish it. By the 2nd week of November, the most feared cavalry officer in the British Army was riding into the PD country with orders to finish it. Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton was 26 years old and commanded the British Legion, a Loyalist provincial corps of cavalry and mounted infantry in green coats. He was fast, ruthless, extremely capable, and by that autumn, the most hated man in South Carolina. A reputation earned at the Waxhaws in May, where his men cut down surrendering Continentals in circumstances that were disputed then and are disputed now, and which handed the American cause a recruiting slogan for the rest of the war. Tarleton was the correct answer to Marion in the abstract. Mounted, aggressive, unencumbered, willing to move fast and hit hard. The British Legion was the one force in the theater that could theoretically match a partisan brigade for speed. In early November, a Loyalist informant located Marion's camp and got word to him. On the 7th, there was a confrontation around Richburg's mill and the Richardson plantation, and Tarleton came close enough that he burned property in the neighborhood, trying to draw Marion into a fight. What followed on the 8th of November, 1780, is the most famous episode of the entire campaign, and it consists almost entirely of a man riding away. Marion learned Tarleton was coming. Of course he did, because that is what the intelligence network was for. And he ran, not in panic, in sequence. He moved his brigade out ahead of the pursuit and led it through country he had chosen. From Jack's Creek, down along the Pocotaligo, roughly 26 miles of it over about 7 hours, with the Legion behind him the whole way. And look at the direction he takes it, because this is not flight. It is a route with a design. Marion pulls Tarleton off the ridges and into the bottoms. Every mile takes the pursuit further from a road, deeper into ground where a heavy dragoon horse breaks through the crust and sinks, where a column strings out to single file, where the men have to hack through cane, where nobody can see more than 20 yards, and where a well-drilled cavalry formation is just a long queue of tired men. Marion's people, meanwhile, are riding through their own back garden on horses selected for exactly this. 7 hours in, the pursuit reached the edge of Ox Swamp, a broad, impassable quagmire with no visible bottom, into which the partisans had simply gone. And Tarleton stopped. Tarleton did not come on. Now, the legend, because this is where it gets made, and it is worth being exact about the difference between what happened and what is repeated, what is solidly established. Tarleton pursued Marion a long distance on the 8th of November, exhausted his command doing it, failed to bring the partisans to action, and abandoned the chase at the edge of impassable swamp. What is also true, and almost always left out, he did not merely give up in frustration. He broke off because there was another target. Thomas Sumter was operating to the west, and Cornwallis wanted him dealt with. And Tarleton turned in that direction, where he would fight Sumter at Blackstock's farm later that month, in an engagement both sides claimed. The Ox Swamp pursuit was not the end of Tarleton's autumn. It was one failed morning inside a busy campaign. And what is legend? The line. The famous quotation is usually given in two halves. Tarleton, turning his men around, says something to the effect that they will go back and find the gamecock, meaning Sumter. But that, as for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him. Notice that the first half of the line, the half that usually gets cut, is the part that matches the documented evidence. He turned toward Sumter. The second half is another matter. It does not appear in Tarleton's own account of the campaign, which he published in 1787 and in which he was not generally shy about narrating his own doings. It surfaces later in the American biographical tradition, in the hands of the same writers who gave us The Whale and The Cherry Tree. Did Tarleton say something like it? Possibly. Frustrated cavalry officers say things. Did he say that in those words, on that day at the edge of that swamp, thereby christening the most famous partisan of the American Revolution? There is no contemporary evidence for it. The nickname Swamp Fox does not appear to have been in common use during the war at all. It arrives with the biographers decades later, and it is so good that it retroactively colonized the history. We are telling you this not to spoil it. We are telling you because the actual event is better. Strip away the quotation, and what remains is this: the finest cavalry commander in the British Southern Army, at the head of the best mounted troops available to the Crown in America, spent 7 hours chasing a militia colonel and a few dozen farmers, wrecked his horses doing it, never made contact, and went home. Nothing was captured. Nobody was killed. No ground changed hands. And it was a total, unambiguous victory for Francis Marion, because the objective was never to win a fight. The objective was to make the British spend a day, 100 horses worth of condition, and their best regiment's time achieving nothing at all. They paid it. And a week later, the war took something from Marion that no amount of good intelligence could have prevented. A week later, the war took something from Marion that no amount of good intelligence could have prevented. With Tarleton drawn off westward toward Sumter, Marion moved on Georgetown. Georgetown was the second port of South Carolina and the British supply node for the whole northeastern part of the state. Taking it would have been the most significant thing any partisan force in the theater had achieved. On the 15th of November, Marion came down to look at it, and he could not take it. This is worth saying plainly. because it is the boundary of the method. Marion had no artillery. He had put his only 2 guns into a swamp in September. He had no engineers, no siege train, no way to breach a defended earthwork, and no ability to hold a force in position long enough to starve one out, against a garrison that stayed behind its works and declined to come out and be ambushed. A partisan brigade has nothing to offer. He probed the outskirts, skirmished around the plantations west of the town, and pulled back. He would come at Georgetown 4 separate times over the next 7 months, and take it only when Continental troops and a siege were available. And in the fighting near White's Bridge that day, a small party of Marion's men was cut off. Among them was Gabriel Marion, his nephew. Gabriel was taken alive. When his captors established who he was shot. The accounts of exactly how are late and vary in their details, and we will not pretend to a precision the sources do not have. What is consistent across them is that he had surrendered, that he was identified as Marion's nephew, and that the identification is what killed him. That is the Carolina Civil War in one sentence. Not a battlefield death, a recognition. Now watch what Marion does with it, because this is the point at which most commanders in that theater, in that year, would have started hanging people. Retaliatory execution was standard practice on both sides of the backcountry war by late 1780. Loyalists hanged captured patriots. Patriots hanged captured loyalists. Every atrocity generated its answer within a week, and the districts Marion operated in were already several rounds into that cycle before he arrived. Marion did not answer it. He is recorded as having been badly shaken, and he continued to restrain his men from reprisal killings. A policy he maintained through the rest of the war, at some cost to his popularity among officers who wanted blood and could not understand why they were not being given it. We should be careful not to turn this into sainthood. Marion's brigade was not gentle. Prisoners were roughly handled. Plundering was a running problem he complained about for years afterwards. And the war in his districts was ugly, whatever he preferred. But the pattern across 18 months is consistent enough to be a policy rather than an accident. And there is a hard operational logic underneath the decency. A partisan force lives inside a population. The moment it starts executing that population's sons, it becomes an occupying army with worse supply. Marion needed the Williamsburg district to shelter him next month and the month after, and men who hang your cousin are not men you hide in your barn. He stayed in the field through December. On the 12th and 13th of that month, at Halfway Swamp near the Santee, he intercepted a British column under Major McClelroth, escorting recruits up to Camden, and began driving in its pickets. McClelroth sent out a flag of truce to complain that skirmishing from cover was not warfare, and proposed instead that each side put forward 20 picked men to settle the matter in the open. Marion agreed. He sent 20 men under Major Vanderhorst, with orders to hold their fire until the range was short. The 2 parties advanced, and at somewhere under 100 yards, before a shot was fired, the British detachment turned and went back to its lines. That night, McClelroth's column slipped away in the dark, leaving equipment and supplies behind. We include that not because it decided anything, it decided nothing at all, but because it is the clearest surviving picture of the collision between 2 entirely different ideas of what war is. One side proposing a formal contest of honor, the other agreeing, turning up, and quietly intending to shoot first. Then in December, Marion established a standing camp at Snow's Island. It was a tract of high, dry ground of perhaps 5 square miles, bounded by water on 3 sides and swamp on the 4th, under a canopy of cypress with dense cane, vine, and briar around its margins. It had fresh water, game, timber, and concealed landings where boats could come and go unobserved. There were very few practical ways in, and Marion controlled them. For the first time, the brigade had somewhere to put things. Captured powder could be stored rather than carried. Wounded men could be left to recover instead of riding. Horses could be rested and grazed. Messages could be routed to a fixed address instead of chasing a moving column around 3 counties. This was the transition from a raiding party into an organization, and it is the least dramatic and most consequential development of the whole year. In August, Marion commanded whoever happened to be riding with him. By January, he commanded a brigade with a base, a supply of sorts, an intelligence network with a destination, and a reputation that brought men to him without recruiting. Snow's Island would remain the brigade's home until it was betrayed and destroyed in March of 1781, by which point it had done its work. And it is Snow's Island, more than any battlefield, that supplied this campaign with its most famous story and its least reliable one. It is Snow's Island, more than any battlefield, that supplied this campaign with its most famous story and its least reliable one. It is a breakfast that probably did not happen the way you have heard it, and it is the strangest thing about Francis Marion's afterlife. The story goes like this. A British officer comes out to Marion's camp under a flag of truce to negotiate a prisoner exchange. Because the camp's location is the brigade's single greatest asset, he is blindfolded at the swamp's edge and led in by a circuitous route so he cannot find it again. The bandage comes off. He conducts his business with the general. Marion then invites him to stay for breakfast. The officer looks around. There is no mess tent. There are no supply wagons, no commissary, no cooks, no camp furniture. None of the apparatus that a European army carries with it, as a matter of course. Marion gives an instruction to his servant, who is identified in the tradition as Oscar Marion. The man rakes back the ashes of last night's fire, pulls out a few roasted sweet potatoes, brushes them off, and serves them on slabs of pine bark, with water from the swamp in a gourd. That is the meal. That is all of the meal. The officer, in the story, asks whether this is normal. He is told that it is, that in fact it is rather better than usual, because they have potatoes today, and that the men serve without pay, without uniforms, without supply, and without any expectation that this will change. He returns to his garrison, resigns his commission, and declares that an enemy who will fight on roots and water for an idea cannot be beaten. Now, how much of that is real? The honest answer is that the potatoes are plausible, the officer is unverifiable, and the resignation is almost certainly invention. The story comes to us through Weems, the same Weems doing the same job he did on Washington, which was to supply a young country with founding scripture in a form that could be read aloud to children. There is no named officer. There is no British record of a commission resigned for this reason. The tale reaches print decades after the war, in a book written to sell, by a man whose relationship with verification was recreational at best. And then it went somewhere no anecdote should be able to go. In the early 19th century, John Blake White painted it. The painting hung in the United States Capitol, was engraved onto South Carolina banknotes. It became one of the most reproduced images of the Revolution in existence. A scene supplied by a fabulist, elevated to national art, and circulated as money. So why are we spending time on it? Because the fabrication is doing something true, and telling you where the line runs between them is more interesting than either half alone. Everything in that scene, except the officer's conversion, is consistent with the documented conditions of Marion's brigade. They genuinely had no supply system. They genuinely ate what they could dig, shoot, or carry. They genuinely served without pay. Most of them never received any. And after the war, a number of them petitioned for compensation and did not get it. Marion genuinely shared their conditions rather than keeping a separate officer's table. And that is attested by men who served with him and had no reason to flatter him, including men who found him personally disagreeable. The sweet potato dinner is a lie about a specific morning that accurately describes 18 months. And underneath the anecdote sits the actual strategic insight, which Weems stumbled into without quite understanding what he had. A conventional army has a center of gravity, the thing that, if you destroy it, ends its ability to fight. Take the capital, destroy the field army, cut the supply line, and the war is over. That is not a rule of thumb. That is how the British had been operating for 5 years, and it is why Charleston and Camden should have finished the Southern War. Marion's brigade had no such thing. There was no capital to take. There was no supply line to cut, because there was no supply. There was no payroll to seize, no depot to burn, no headquarters to capture. The force dissolved into the population when threatened and reconstituted when the threat left. Even Snow's Island, when the British finally did locate and destroy it in the spring of 1781, cost Marion stores and prisoners and changed nothing about his ability to operate. You cannot destroy a center of gravity that does not exist. The British spent 2 years looking for one. That is the real content of the sweet potato story, and it is why the British officer in it is the most useful fictional character in the campaign. He is the audience surrogate for an entire army's confusion. He walks into the swamp expecting to find an enemy, an organization, a headquarters, a thing, and finds 4 men, a fire, and some root vegetables. And the discovery is disorienting, because there is nothing there to defeat. One more thing about the legend, and then we will get to the consequences, because this matters for how you should hold everything you have just heard. The Marion of popular memory, the cheerful, dashing swamp fox, romantic outlaw of the Carolina wetlands, is substantially the creation of Weems, of Peter Horry's edited memoirs, and later of the novelist William Gilmore Simms, who wrote Marion into the founding mythology of the antebellum South. Horry, who had actually served with Marion, read what Weems had made of his manuscript and complained bitterly that it was not the history he had written. He was right. He was also comprehensively ignored, because Weems's version was better entertainment, and it is Weems's version that reached the 20th century, the television serial, and eventually the cinema. The consequence is that the genuinely remarkable thing about this campaign got buried under an adventure story. Marion was not a dashing figure. He was a small, silent, physically unimpressive middle-aged man who was extraordinarily good at accounting for risk, and who won by declining battles rather than seeking them. That is a harder story to sell. It is also the one that soldiers still study. Because in December of 1780, a new American commander arrived in the South who understood exactly what Marion was worth, and who was the first professional soldier on either side to work out how to use him. In December of 1780, a new American commander arrived in the South who understood exactly what Marion was worth, and who was the first professional soldier on either side to work out how to use him. Major General Nathaniel Greene took over the Southern Department at Charlotte, North Carolina, on the 2nd of December, 1780, and inherited what was, by any conventional assessment, not an army. Somewhere around 1,500 men fit for duty, badly clothed, badly fed, and thoroughly beaten. Greene had been Washington's quartermaster general. That is not a glamorous line on a record of service, and it is the most important fact about him. He had spent years thinking about supply, distance, forage, and what an army physically requires to remain an army. Which meant that when he looked at the Southern theater, he saw the same thing Marion saw. He then did something that every military textbook of the period explicitly forbade. Facing a stronger enemy, he divided his inferior force. It was, on the face of it, an invitation to be destroyed in detail. It was also the only move that made sense, because Greene had understood something about the war he had walked into. He was not going to win it with his own troops. He was going to win it by making Cornwallis's position in South Carolina unsustainable, and the instruments for that were already in the field. Marion in the east, along the Santee and the PD, Thomas Sumter in the center, Andrew Pickens in the west. Greene's correspondence with Marion is the clearest evidence of what changed. He did not treat Marion as an irregular auxiliary to be tolerated. He wrote to him as a subordinate commander with an assigned operational role, interdicting British communications, screening movements, and supplying the intelligence Greene's own army could not generate. And through 1781, Marion's brigade did something genuinely unusual for a partisan force. It transitioned. Not entirely, and not without friction, but it began operating in combination with regular troops in ways that partisan bands almost never manage. Fort Watson, in April of 1781, Marion and Lieutenant Colonel Henry Lee besieged a fortified British post built on an ancient Native American mound, with no artillery between them. They built a log tower taller than the stockade, put riflemen at the top of it, made the interior of the fort untenable. The garrison surrendered on the 23rd of April. Fort Mott, the 12th of May, 1781. A fortified plantation house. Marion and Lee set the roof alight, and the tradition holds that the owner, Rebecca Motti, supplied the means to burn her own home. The garrison surrendered. Eutaw Springs, the 8th of September, 1781. The last major engagement in the Carolinas, and one of the bloodiest of the war for the numbers involved. Marion's militia held part of Greene's front line in the open, in formal battle against British regulars, and did not break. For a force of unpaid volunteers, that is remarkable, and Greene said so. Now step back and total the ledger, because the strategic accounting is where this campaign actually gets settled. First, Marion denied Cornwallis a secure rear. This is the decisive effect, and it is worth being blunt about the mechanism. The Southern strategy required South Carolina to be pacified so that the army could move north. Cornwallis did move north, into North Carolina, then Virginia. But he did it over an interior that was never actually secured, with supply lines that were never actually safe. And he did it while continuously detaching troops to deal with problems behind him. Every regular escorting a convoy on the Santee Road was a regular not in the line at Guilford Courthouse. Every dragoon riding into the PD was a dragoon not screening the march. The loyalist militia that the entire scheme depended on was progressively demoralized by exactly the demonstrations Marion had been staging since August of 1780. That the Crown could not protect the people who sided with it. Cornwallis ended up on a peninsula in Virginia in October of 1781, with an army thinned by a war it had never managed to finish behind it. Second, Marion kept the rebellion politically alive at the moment it had no other means of existing. Between May and December of 1780, there was no Continental Army in South Carolina worth the name, and no state government inside the state. What there was instead was evidence, a running series of small, well-publicized demonstrations that the occupation could be hurt. That evidence is the reason the loyalty oaths did not hold, the reason recruits kept riding in, and the reason there was a functioning partisan infrastructure for Greene to plug into when he arrived. Third, he preserved a force. Through the worst autumn of the war, when every other American commander in the theater lost an army, Marion never lost his. He walked away from Wemyss. He walked away from Tarleton. He abandoned artillery rather than be slowed by it, and dismissed his own men rather than risk them. That is the whole of it. Do not be surprised that it looks unheroic. That is the finding. Now the honest caveats. Because a channel that hands you Weems's version with a straight face has no business calling itself rigorous. Marion did not do this alone, and the popular memory that centers him has quietly demoted others. Sumter tied down substantial British forces in the center of the state, at greater cost and with less discipline, but he tied them down. Pickens did the same in the West, and the militia victory at Kings Mountain on the 7th of October, 1780, fought by men from over the mountains, with no connection to Marion at all, did more immediate damage to Cornwallis's loyalist strategy in a single afternoon than Marion's entire autumn did. The partisan war also had a character that the potato story completely obscures. This was a civil war between neighbors, and it was savage in both directions. Loyalist militia burned Patriot farms. Patriot militia burned Loyalist ones. Prisoners were hanged by both sides. Marion himself, by the standards of that war, was notably restrained. He tried to stop the worst of the retaliation in his districts, and he opposed the practice of paying militia in confiscated slaves that Sumter adopted in 1781, which is a fact that sits uncomfortably beside his own ownership of them, and should be reported rather than smoothed. And the largest question of all is one this campaign does not resolve. Marion fought for a republic that would deny liberty to Oscar Marion and to every other black man who guided, rode, scouted, and fought for the brigade. The recognition of Oscar's service in 2006 was a genuine correction. It came 220-odd years late, and it corrected one name. There is one more claim frequently made about Marion that deserves a straight answer, because it is made confidently and it is only partly earned. You will hear that Marion invented American guerrilla warfare, or that he was the father of modern special operations, or that the United States Army Rangers descend from him. That lineage claim is genuinely made, and Marion is regularly taught at professional military schools as a case study in what modern doctrine calls maneuver warfare. The deliberate shattering of an enemy's cohesion through speed and unexpectedness, rather than the destruction of his troops. But he did not invent any of it. He learned it from Cherokee warriors who had been practicing it in those mountains long before he arrived. And it had been practiced in Ireland, in Spain, in the Balkans, and everywhere else an occupied population has ever faced an army it could not meet in the open. What Marion did was demonstrate it in English, in a war that Americans would spend the next 2 centuries writing about, which is a different achievement and a real one. He went home after the war to Pond Bluff, which had been thoroughly wrecked. He served in the state senate. He married a cousin, Mary Esther Vidot, in 1786. He argued for leniency toward former Loyalists at a moment when leniency was not popular, which, given what Wemyss had done to his district, is the most interesting political position he ever took. He died on the 27th of February, 1795, at about 63. Pond Bluff is underwater now. Lake Marion, impounded behind a dam in the 1940s, covers the site. The swamp got it in the end. The swamp got it in the end. Go back to where we started. The flooded timber between the Santee and the PD in the autumn of 1780, with a limping man and a few dozen followers in it, and a British army in complete possession of everything that could be possessed. And the occupation was already failing, because the occupation was never about ground. It was about whether the crown could make South Carolina cheap enough to keep. Marion's entire campaign consisted of raising the price. A convoy escort here, a wasted regiment there, a loyalist militia that stopped turning out, a dispatch that arrived 4 days late, a road that could not be used at night. None of it decisive, all of it compounding. Until a general in Virginia found himself with too few men in the wrong place, waiting on a fleet that was not coming. That is what irregular warfare actually is, underneath the folklore. Not heroism, not daring. Arithmetic, performed patiently, by people who have decided that they are willing to keep doing it for longer than you are willing to keep paying for it. The British in 1780 were not stupid, and they were not badly led. Cornwallis was a good general. Tarleton was a superb cavalry officer. Wemyss was doing what his instructions and his professional training told him to do. Every one of them was excellent at the war they had been taught, and every one of them lost to a small knock-kneed man on a stolen horse who simply refused to fight the war they had come to fight. That is the thing worth taking away from this. The failure was not one of skill. It was a failure to notice that the question had changed. So here is the one to sit with, which raises an uncomfortable possibility about every war of this kind fought since. Perhaps the partisan is never really the decisive factor at all. Perhaps he is only ever the visible symptom of an occupation that has already lost the argument, and the fighting is just how long it takes everyone to find out. Francis Marion would probably not have put it that way. He was not a theorist, and he was famously reluctant to explain himself to anybody, including the men who followed him. But he understood the essential thing, and he understood it in 1780 when nobody in a red coat did. He did not need to beat them. He only needed to still be there in the morning. If you'd rather listen than watch, we're now also live on Spotify. Full episodes, same narration, link below. Thanks for watching.